Welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be talking about and walking through Palantir and its path to getting into the S&P 500 index using Tesla as an example when they got into it in late 2020. We'll be showing what it means for the stock price of a company that gets included with a heavy retail following like Tesla and the general process and something that might surprise you that I think could delay Palantir's inclusion. Let's get started. Tesla, you'll see here, turned its fourth quarterly profit in a row, a first for the company, and this was middle of the year of 2020, and The Verge reporting $104 million in the second quarter was what they profited there. So here's an article basically showing their profit and loss as well as their revenue. I'm just going to break it out and show you the P&L for Tesla. Very thin here, but they were able to eke it out, much like Palantir is doing. Currently, Palantir is not printing tremendous profits. They're printing free cash flow, but not EPS just yet. And as you'll see, Tesla here was pretty much break even across the way, but that's all they needed to get the go-ahead for potential inclusion after Q2 of 2020 and their fourth quarterly profit. However, if you recall and were following the company and the stock, I remember this vividly. Tesla was actually left out of the S&P 500 the first time it was eligible. So as you'll see here, they were eligible in the summer of 2020, but here we are in September, and they were left out once the S&P 500 index did its review of the company, and they were passed on for the inclusion, really halted it, and I believe dropped it by some double-digit percentage, so really put it to a halt. And this really came as a surprise to everyone that felt as though Tesla was going to get included now that they were eligible. But it's not something that just automatically happens. The S&P Dow Jones indices determines the makeup of the index, and they're ultimately the ones to choose. So, of course, the bullish investors were disappointed that the stock did not get included after it was available, and many investors had already piled into the stock expecting that its shares would continue to climb. So that's important, that expectations don't get ahead of the future and what's ultimately going to happen. They say a mathematical formula alone doesn't decide what is added or deleted from the S&P 500. Their methodology includes selecting constituent stocks with a basic criteria, which I'm going to show you in a moment, based in the US, where shares trade on an American exchange and everything like that. But beyond a few rules, the S&P 500 makeup is at the discretion of the index committee. That's the main point that I want to get across here. So what they did say is the quality of the earnings were an issue for them at this time. Tesla's positive profitability has been driven by the sale of regulatory credits to other auto manufacturers who need offsets. And so if you follow the Tesla story at all, which I know many of you do, you know that this was a hesitation and essentially a bear case of the company that was unfounded. So you can expect something similar in terms of scrutiny for Palantir when they do become eligible for the first time and they do get looked at. So I just want to make that clear that if in another 2 quarters, Palantir is able to recognize its first full year of profitability on a quarterly basis, that it does not alone determine they will get immediately included in the next cycle. But I just want to show you here, Tesla did get included the quarter or the couple months later on in November of 2020. So it was honestly a buying opportunity at that point because it was going to happen eventually. But I won't go through all of this. I just want to show you what the criteria was that they evaluated as a baseline. So the earnings criterion for most recent consecutive quarters as reported earnings should be positive, as should the most recent quarter. So we know that Palantir's on track there, nothing to worry about. Then the liquidity criterion. so that everyone tracking the index will be able to get in and out without a problem. The ratio of annual dollar value traded to float adjusted market capitalization should be 1 or greater, and the stock should trade a minimum of 250,000 shares in each of the 6 months leading up to the evaluation date. Again, not a problem for Palantir. How about the market capitalization? Not a problem for Palantir. 8 billion is the requirement, and Palantir is well north of that. And then we need at least 10% of shares publicly floated, much more than that for Palantir. Nothing to worry about there. 12 months of IPO history. Palantir's been public for 3 years and being a US company. So we've checked all the boxes there. Now I want to show you and talk about what happened to the stock for Tesla and why is this a fair comparison. So I believe this is a fair comparison because of the retail backing of a name like Tesla, and you really do get wild fluctuations in sentiment, big build up in a lot of the momentum behind the name, and sell-offs, as you'll see, and we'll look at. I think you have a similar investor base, growth, tech-focused, that you find in both companies. So I think it's a fair comparison. Of course, it's not going to be an exact analogy that we can make, but I do want to scroll back here and talk about ultimately what happened, because I was in the stock when this was occurring. So Tesla had its tremendous run up from late 2019 into early 2020. It continued throughout, and here we are essentially chopping along, and with the expectation, once they qualify, that they will get, let me just actually zoom in here so we can have a better sense of what occurred. So if we recall the timeline of events here, turned their fourth quarter of GAAP profitability in July of 2020. So let's have a look at where the stock was in July of 2020. So right around here is where they turned their fourth consecutive quarter. So the stock had already ramped up, right? The company had its P&L inflection, and the investors were realizing that, and Palantir is currently in the process of its P&L inflection. So certainly some positive momentum up to this point. September, if we can just go along here, that's where they were not included, right there. Oh, actually, sorry, it would have been this. It would have been this right here. So that sell-off from almost 200 down to almost 100. It was a significant drawdown, I recall. And so you had that disappointment, right? Because we had the buildup of the expectations and then the subsequent drawdown as investors didn't want to wait, at least speculators didn't want to wait another 2 months for the inclusion. So when that inclusion did come, as we said, in mid-November, that's the spike right here. And the continuation, and the shares outstanding significantly decreased, and the shares available to trade. So we had some supply and demand dynamics where suddenly the shares were much more demanded, funds that track the index, as well as the fact that Tesla was now a certified S&P 500 company. But the supply was decreasing, right? Because a lot of these shares were getting locked up in these index funds. So it really was the start of this big run for Tesla, and it did subsequently see a drawdown, but that happened later on. And then it led to another run, right? So I just wanted to show you the progress of events and how that occurred between the fundamentals of the company improving, leading to a natural rise in the stock price. Then, potential traders getting out of it when the announcement happened or didn't happen in this case. But then when the buying did occur on that day, I remember the stock gapped up, at least in the closing. The best trade for that day was placing a sell at close. That's where the stock hit the peak. But I wanted to make it clear that this is not a trade, right? Even for Palantir, this is not a trade, because look at what happened to the stock after it got included, right? Because the supply decreased. There was a lot of demand. It was getting talked about a lot. It was certainly a hot stock at that point, like I think Palantir will be. There's a lot more upside. So even when the traders get out, the potential is still there for the stock to continue to run. But of course, it will retrace at some point. So I wanted to make this video explaining that, and hopefully it was a good rundown for you in terms of expectations when Palantir gets included in the index in 2024. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Until next time.